Pierre Bourdieu. Distinction. Chapter 2. The Social Space and Its Transformations. Section 1. Class Condition and Social Conditioning.
Before we begin, I want you to notice something about your own body right now, wherever you are sitting. Notice how you are sitting. Notice whether your shoulders are relaxed or braced. Notice whether you feel, underneath everything else, a low background hum of urgency, of things still to be done, of money still to be found, or whether you feel, underneath everything else, a kind of settled calm, as though time itself belongs to you. That feeling, that specific bodily hum or calm, was not generated today. It was not generated by your morning. It was generated over years by something I call your condition of existence. And by the end of this chapter, you will understand why two people can live in the same city, speak the same language, and still inhabit what are, in every meaningful sense, two different planets.
Start with the phrase itself. Class condition. What exactly are you naming?
I am naming something more basic and more powerful than income. I am naming the objective conditions a person is forced to live inside, day after day, year after year, conditions that exist entirely independent of whether that person likes them, resents them, or has even named them to themselves. The factory worker's condition is defined by physical exhaustion, by unpredictable hours, by a wage that must be spent almost as fast as it arrives. The condition of a family with inherited wealth is defined by exactly the opposite. Time that stretches ahead safely. Money that solves problems before they become emergencies. A future that does not need to be defended, only managed. And here is the crucial move, the move most people never make. These objective conditions do not simply sit outside a person, like weather. They get inside the person. They shape reflexes, timing, patience, ambition, even the capacity to imagine a different life at all. I call this social conditioning, and it produces something durable enough to survive even when the original conditions change.
Give us a concrete, almost laughably ordinary example of this conditioning in action, something a listener could recognize from their own life within seconds.
Consider how differently two people respond to an unexpected expense. Say a car needs a repair, costing a moderate but real sum. One person, shaped for years by a condition of scarcity, feels an immediate jolt of anxiety, begins mentally rearranging which bill will now go unpaid, and may lose sleep over it for several nights. Another person, shaped for years by a condition of security, feels mild annoyance, pays it, and forgets about it by dinner. Neither person chose that reaction in the moment. Neither person is being dramatic or careless. Both are executing a reflex trained into them across a decade or more of living inside a specific relationship to money and time. The jolt of anxiety and the shrug of mild annoyance are both, equally, products of conditioning, not of character.
And this conditioning does not only shape how people react to bad news. You have argued it shapes something even larger. The very horizon of what a person believes is realistically possible for their own life.
This is perhaps the cruelest part of the mechanism, and I want to state it as plainly as I can. People raised inside conditions of scarcity and unpredictability very often develop what looks, from the outside, like modest ambition, a preference for the safe, known path over the risky, open one. Critics of the poor love to call this a lack of drive, a failure of imagination. I call it something else entirely. A perfectly rational adaptation to a world that has, so far, punished excessive hope more often than it has rewarded it. Meanwhile, people raised inside conditions of security develop precisely the opposite reflex, an ease with risk, a willingness to gamble a few years on an uncertain path, a startup, an unpaid internship, an artistic career, because the underlying floor, family money, family connections, family safety nets, means the worst-case scenario was never truly catastrophic to begin with. What gets celebrated afterward as boldness or vision was very often simply the ordinary behavior of someone whose downside was cushioned before they ever took the leap.
There is a very live, very current political fight sitting directly underneath everything you have just described. The entire modern debate around economic precarity and the so-called gig economy.
Look closely at this debate, and you will find my exact argument playing out, almost word for word, without either side naming it correctly. One side insists that gig work, unpredictable shifts, contract labor without benefits is liberating, flexible, entrepreneurial, a chance for anyone to be their own boss. The other side insists the same arrangement produces chronic, corrosive insecurity, a permanent inability to plan more than a week ahead. Both sides are correct, and both sides are describing the same objective condition through the filter of a different starting point. For someone with inherited savings, a partner's stable income, or family property to fall back on, gig work really can function as flexible freedom, an interesting supplement rather than a threat. For someone with none of that cushioning, the identical contract, the identical app, the identical unpredictable schedule produces exactly the chronic hum of urgency I asked you to notice at the very start of this chapter. Same policy, same technology, two entirely different conditions of existence, depending on what already sits underneath the person signing the contract.
Here is something worth testing on yourself before we continue, and worth saying out loud to someone near you tonight.
Think of one financial decision you consider obviously sensible, obviously the responsible choice any reasonable adult would make. Now ask yourself honestly, what floor was sitting underneath you when you made it? A parent who could lend money in an emergency. A degree that guaranteed some minimum level of employability. A partner's income quietly absorbing the risk you thought you were taking alone. If you can name that floor, you have just located your own class condition, doing its quiet work, disguised as your own personal good sense.
This is exactly the kind of realization that reframes an entire argument you might have had with a friend or a relative about who deserves credit for their success. If it landed for you, it is worth passing on, because almost nobody walks through their own reasonable decisions asking what invisible floor made them feel reasonable in the first place.
In our next section, we take this idea of class condition and turn it into something far more precise than a feeling. An actual map, a geometric space with real coordinates on which every profession, every household, every one of us can be plotted with startling accuracy.
Section 2. A Three-Dimensional Space, Part 1. The Map of Society.
I spent years of my working life doing something that sounds, on its surface, almost absurdly technical. Collecting thousands of survey responses about food, music, furniture, holidays, sport, and then feeding all of it into a statistical technique that could take this enormous, chaotic pile of individual preferences and compress it down into something you could actually see. A map, a picture of an entire society, laid out on two axes with real coordinates, on which I could place not only individuals, but entire professions, entire lifestyles, entire ways of being in the world.
Walk us through the map itself, because this is the single most famous image to come out of this entire body of work, even for people who have never opened the book.
Picture a large square page. Draw one line straight up the middle, from bottom to top. This vertical axis measures something I call the overall volume of capital. Not simply money. The total combined weight of everything we discussed in our previous chapter, economic capital, cultural capital, and social capital, the value of who you know, all added together into a single overall quantity. At the very bottom of this line sit those with almost none of any kind of capital. At the very top sit those overflowing with all three at once, the genuinely dominant class. Now draw a second line, horizontal this time, crossing directly through the middle of the first one. This horizontal axis does not measure how much capital a person has. It measures the composition of that capital, the specific mixture. On the far left of this line, place people whose capital is overwhelmingly economic: industrialists, business owners, people rich in money and property but comparatively poor in institutionalized education or high culture. On the far right, place people whose capital is overwhelmingly cultural: professors, artists, writers, people rich in degrees, books, and refined taste, but often comparatively modest in actual income.
So the same overall wealth can sit in two completely different places on this map, depending entirely on whether it arrives as money or as culture.
Precisely, and this is the entire genius of the model, if I may say so without false modesty. Two families can occupy the exact same height on the vertical axis, meaning they command, in total, roughly the same overall social power, and yet sit on opposite ends of the horizontal axis, meaning they experience, express, and defend that power in almost opposite ways. A wealthy factory-owning family and a family of eminent university professors might both belong comfortably to the dominant class. But put them at the same dinner table, and you will watch two entirely different value systems collide, one instinctively respecting decisiveness, profit, and practical results, the other instinctively respecting nuance, erudition, and disinterested reflection.
Bring this fully into the present, because this exact tension, business-minded wealth versus credentialed intellectual authority, animates an enormous amount of current public argument.
Watch any modern argument between a successful entrepreneur, proud of having built something real with their own hands, dismissive of what they call ivory tower theorizing, and a tenured academic, equally proud of years of rigorous training, dismissive of what they consider the entrepreneur's simplistic, profit-obsessed worldview. Both figures may earn similar incomes. Both may send their children to similar schools. And yet the argument between them can become startlingly bitter, precisely because they are not simply disagreeing about a policy. They are defending two different regions of the exact same map, two different, historically rival ways of converting capital into legitimate authority.
Now place ordinary people, not just the elite, onto the same map. Where does everybody else live?
Move down the vertical axis, toward the bottom of the square, and you find the working class and the unemployed, low in overall capital of every kind, but still meaningfully spread across the horizontal axis. A skilled tradesperson with strong practical know-how but little formal schooling sits closer to the economic side. A poorly paid but highly educated worker, an adjunct teacher, an underemployed graduate, sits closer to the cultural side, rich in credentials relative to their income, a position that produces its own very particular frustration, a sense of being overqualified for one's own life. And in the middle of the square, neither dominant nor dominated, sits the vast, anxious middle, the small business owners, the mid-level managers, the school teachers, the middle classes we have discussed before, occupying a genuinely uncomfortable position, close enough to see the dominant class clearly, far enough away to never quite arrive there.
Here is something worth testing on yourself before we move to the final dimension of this map.
Try right now to place yourself honestly on this square, not where you wish you sat, where the actual mixture of your income, your education, your family background, and your professional world would place you. Notice how uncomfortable or how oddly clarifying that exercise feels. Most people have never once tried to locate themselves this precisely, and yet almost everyone has a private, intuitive sense of roughly where they belong the moment they are asked.
If placing yourself on this map surprised you even slightly, that surprise is worth sharing, because almost nobody has ever seen their own life reduced to two simple, honest coordinates before, and once you have seen it, you start noticing where everyone else around you sits too.
But this map, as I have described it so far, is missing something crucial, something that explains why two people standing at the exact same coordinates today can feel completely different about their own lives. The map so far is frozen, a single photograph. In our next section, we add the third dimension, the one that turns a photograph into a story. Time itself and the direction each of us is moving.
Section 3. A three-dimensional space, Part 2. The direction you are moving.
Imagine two families standing today at the exact same coordinates on the map I described in our last section. Same overall volume of capital. Same balance between economic and cultural capital. On paper, identical. And yet, sit at dinner with each family, and you will discover two entirely different emotional worlds. One family arrived at this position last year, rising rapidly from far below. The other family has been slowly sliding down toward this position for the past decade, from a much higher point their parents and grandparents once occupied. Same coordinates, same square inch of the map. Completely different lived experience, because I have left out the dimension that matters most for how a life actually feels from the inside. Trajectory.
Explain what you mean by trajectory as a genuine third dimension of the space, not simply a detail.
Picture our two-dimensional square from before, and now imagine lifting it into the air, adding depth, a third axis running through time itself, tracking where a family sat a generation ago compared to where it sits now. Two arrows can arrive at the identical point on the flat map, while pointing in completely opposite directions in this third dimension. One arrow rising steeply from below, the other falling steeply from above. The family rising rapidly experiences its current position as a rival, as achievement, as proof that effort and talent are finally being rewarded. Every year at this level feels like a small victory. The family declining experiences the identical position as loss, as a slow, humiliating retreat from a status they still remember, sometimes painfully, sometimes with denial as rightfully theirs. Every year at this same level feels like a small defeat.
This distinction seems to explain something enormous about modern politics, a pattern almost everyone has noticed, but rarely named this precisely.
It explains, I would argue, one of the central emotional engines behind the populist political movements that have reshaped nearly every wealthy democracy over the past 2 decades. Look closely at who tends to feel the most acute, most politically activated resentment, and you very often find, not the poorest people in absolute terms, but people whose families occupy a position their parents or grandparents once held with more security and higher relative standing. Workers in industries that used to guarantee a stable, respected, middle-class life, and no longer do. The steelworker, the factory hand, the small manufacturer, whose father or grandfather occupied a genuinely respected, comfortably middle position in the social space of their era, now finds himself, at the same or even slightly higher raw income, occupying a position that carries far less relative respect, far less security, and far less hope for his own children's future. He is not moving downward on paper nearly as dramatically as he is moving downward in relative status, in trajectory, in the story his own family used to tell about itself. That gap between remembered position and current position, more than raw poverty alone, produces a very specific, very potent kind of political anger.
And the opposite trajectory, rapid rise, has its own distinct and equally recognizable modern character.
Consider the rapid rise of certain technology workers over the past 2 decades, young people, sometimes with comparatively modest family backgrounds, suddenly commanding salaries and equity that place them, in raw economic terms, far above where their own parents ever stood. This produces a genuinely fascinating instability, because the rise in economic capital very often outpaces, by years, sometimes by an entire lifetime, the accumulation of embodied and institutionalized cultural capital that traditionally accompanied that level of wealth. The result is a group occupying an unusually turbulent position on the map, wealthy enough to sit near the top of the vertical axis, but without the generations of accumulated cultural capital that older money at the same height has always used to feel secure there, which is precisely why this group so often becomes an object of exactly the mockery we discussed in an earlier chapter. The wrong hoodie, the tastelessly furnished mansion, the desperate, visible effort to acquire, almost overnight, what older elites absorbed slowly across a childhood.
So trajectory does not simply describe movement. It actively produces distinct personality types, distinct anxieties, distinct political instincts, even among people who, on the flat map alone, would appear to occupy identical ground.
That is the central discovery of adding this third dimension, and I consider it, honestly, one of the most emotionally accurate parts of the entire theory. It explains why a person can feel simultaneously privileged and precarious. It explains why old money so often looks down on new money, despite new money frequently commanding greater actual wealth. It explains why a slow decline can feel more painful, more politically explosive, than a fast rise feels joyful. Loss looms larger than gain, and status, once tasted by a family across a generation, is remembered by the next generation as an entitlement rather than as a temporary, historically contingent position.
Here is something worth sitting with, and worth asking someone in your own family about tonight.
Ask an older relative to describe, honestly, whether they feel their own family's position in the world has risen, held steady, or declined across their own lifetime compared to their parents'. Listen closely to their answer, not simply for the facts, but for the emotional weight behind it. You will very often find political opinions, resentments, and hopes that map almost perfectly onto that single trajectory, far more precisely than they map onto that person's current raw income alone.
If that conversation reveals something surprising, it is worth telling someone else about. Because trajectory, more than almost anything else in this whole framework, explains political anger that otherwise looks, from the outside, deeply irrational and suddenly looks, once you have this tool, entirely coherent.
Now that we have the full three-dimensional map, volume, composition, and trajectory, we turn to the final piece of this chapter, the active, deliberate strategies families use to move themselves across this space on purpose. Because families are not passive dots sitting still on a graph. They are constantly, sometimes desperately, trying to convert one kind of capital into another before the rules of the game change beneath their feet.
Section 4. Reconversion Strategies, Part 1. Turning Money into Culture.
No family sits still on the map I have just described to you. Every family, consciously or not, is constantly running a kind of quiet, generational strategy game, trying to convert whichever capital it holds in abundance into whichever capital will best protect its children's position, especially whenever the exchange rate between different kinds of capital starts to shift.
Explain what you mean by an exchange rate between capitals, because that phrase sounds almost like currency trading applied to family life.
That is exactly the comparison I want you to hold on to. Just as a currency can rise or fall in value against another currency, the practical value of economic capital relative to cultural capital rises and falls across history, depending on how the economy itself is organized. When land and factories can simply be inherited directly, and inheritance alone guarantees position for generations, economic capital converts easily and cheaply into social power. Culture in that world is a pleasant decoration for the wealthy, not a strict requirement for staying wealthy. But when an economy shifts, when direct ownership of land and factories stops guaranteeing status, When credentials, degrees, and licensed professions increasingly gatekeep entry into the best-paying, most respected positions, the exchange rate changes. Suddenly, raw money alone buys less security than it used to. Families who fail to convert some of their economic capital into cultural and institutionalized capital risk watching their children slide down the very map we just built, no matter how much money still sits in the family accounts.
Give us the historical moment where you watched this exchange rate shift happen most clearly.
Look at the French bourgeoisie across the late 1800s and into the 20th century. Earlier generations of this class had built their fortunes directly, in trade, in manufacturing, in commerce, often with only modest formal schooling. But as the century progressed, as professional credentials, law degrees, medical degrees, and the elite grands écoles we discussed in our previous chapter became increasingly necessary gatekeepers for the most prestigious positions in society, these same families began pouring money, with real urgency, into precisely the kind of schooling their own grandparents had never needed and sometimes openly distrusted. This was not vanity. It was a rational, if often unconscious, reconversion strategy, a family recognizing, sometimes only instinctively, that the currency it held in abundance, money, was losing purchasing power in the marketplace of status, and that it needed to trade a portion of that currency for a different one before its children found themselves holding a fortune that could no longer buy the position their family had grown used to.
And this exact strategy, converting economic capital into educational credentials before the exchange rate shifts further, is playing out right now, in an extremely visible, extremely modern form.
Consider the enormous, ever-expanding industry built entirely around helping wealthy families convert money into credentialed advantage for their children. Private tutoring companies charging sums that would represent a working family's entire annual income for a single season of preparation. Consultants who specialize purely in constructing an application, curating extracurricular activities, coaching interview technique, essay writing, all of it designed to convert liquid economic capital into the specific, narrow, institutionalized form of cultural capital that elite universities have been trained to recognize and reward. Even what people now call helicopter parenting, the intensive, hands-on, deeply invested style of raising children common among the professional and upper middle classes, is best understood, in my framework, not simply as an emotional style, but as an active reconversion strategy, converting parental time, attention, and money directly into a child's embodied cultural capital. One supervised violin lesson, one carefully chosen enrichment camp, one curated museum visit at a time.
There is also a specific, very concrete financial motivation behind some of this, tied directly to how governments tax inherited wealth.
Precisely, and this connects our theory directly to an ongoing, very live policy debate. In countries where inheritance taxes on direct financial transfers are significant, wealthy families have strong incentives to convert some portion of that wealth into forms that are far harder for any government to tax or seize, embodied cultural capital chief among them. You cannot levy an inheritance tax on a child's fluent command of 3 languages, their unshakable ease in a job interview, their intuitive understanding of how elite institutions operate. Money transferred directly can be taxed at the border of a generation. Culture transferred silently, at the dinner table, in bedtime reading, in summers abroad, crosses that same border completely untaxed, and often completely unnoticed by anyone looking for inequality in the usual, official places.
That is a genuinely uncomfortable thought for anyone who has ever supported inheritance taxes as a tool for fighting inequality across generations.
It should be uncomfortable, because it reveals a serious limit in how most societies currently try to measure and address inherited advantage. We built entire tax systems to track the movement of money across generations, and largely ignored the much larger, much less visible river of advantage moving alongside it, through language, through confidence, through the thousand small hours of cultural rehearsal that no auditor has ever been asked to count.
Here is something worth testing on yourself, and worth mentioning to a friend who has strong opinions about taxes and inheritance.
Ask yourself what portion of your own advantages, whatever they are, arrived as money you can point to on a bank statement, and what portion arrived as something far quieter, a habit of reading, a confidence in interviews, a family expectation that of course you would attend university, an assumption so deep you never even noticed it was being transferred to you at all.
If naming that quieter inheritance changes how you think about your own success, or someone else's, that is exactly the kind of insight worth sharing, because most conversations about privilege stop at the bank statement, and this chapter asks you to look considerably further than that.
But reconversion does not run in only one direction. In our final section, we look at the reverse strategy, families and individuals who hold enormous cultural capital but comparatively little money, and the sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes ingenious ways they try to convert prestige and taste back into hard currency.
Section 5. Reconversion Strategies, Part 2. Turning culture back into money.
We have seen wealthy families spend enormous sums converting money into cultural capital. Now consider the opposite and in some ways more delicate maneuver. Families and individuals rich in cultural capital, professors, writers, artists, critics, who hold comparatively modest economic capital, and who must find ways to convert prestige, taste, and expertise back into money without appearing to have done so too eagerly.
Why would that conversion need to happen delicately? Surely converting expertise into income is simply called having a career.
Here is the tension, and it runs through nearly every profession built on cultural capital. The entire value of cultural capital depends, in part, on appearing disinterested, on appearing to pursue truth, beauty, or knowledge for its own sake rather than for financial gain. The moment that pursuit looks too obviously commercial, too eager to monetize, it risks losing exactly the prestige that made it valuable in the first place. A scholar who writes purely for money is, in the eyes of their own field, diminished by that very fact. A critic who can be bought is no longer trusted as a critic. Cultural capital, unlike economic capital, punishes its holders for converting it too visibly, too quickly, too nakedly into cash.
And yet history is full of exactly this conversion happening successfully, sometimes quite openly.
Consider the university professor who writes a popular book, translating years of specialized, low-paying academic research into a format the general public will pay for directly. If handled carefully, respected magazine profiles, thoughtful interviews, a tone that still signals seriousness and depth, this conversion can succeed brilliantly, producing genuine wealth while the professor's cultural authority remains largely intact, sometimes even enhanced. Handled carelessly, chasing trends too obviously, oversimplifying complex ideas purely for sales, the same professor risks being quietly reclassified by their own field as a popularizer rather than a serious scholar, a demotion that can follow a career for the rest of its length.
There is an extremely current, extremely visible version of this exact tension, playing out constantly across an entirely new kind of career that did not exist when this book was first written.
The rise of the online content creator offers perhaps the clearest modern laboratory for watching this exact reconversion happen in real time, at enormous speed, in front of an audience. Consider a creator who builds an audience specifically around deep expertise, art history, philosophy, classical literature, careful analysis of film or music. Their entire audience, their entire cultural capital, was built on the appearance of pursuing the subject out of genuine passion rather than profit. The moment that same creator begins inserting sponsored content, launches a paid course, or visibly optimizes their work for algorithmic reach rather than depth. Watch the comment sections. You will find, almost without fail, a portion of the audience expressing a very specific, very predictable disappointment, sometimes phrased exactly this way: they used to be good before they sold out. That phrase, selling out, is nothing more nor less than the audience registering, in plain language, the exact tension I am describing to you. A felt sense that cultural capital has been converted into economic capital a little too visibly, a little too eagerly, and has therefore lost some of what made it valuable and trustworthy in the first place.
So the accusation of selling out is not simply an aesthetic complaint. It is, in your framework, a precise economic observation, dressed up as a moral judgment.
That is exactly the refrain I want you to walk away with. Every time you hear someone accused of selling out, in any field, music, journalism, academia, art, translate that accusation in your head into its structural meaning. This person has converted cultural capital into economic capital at an exchange rate, or at a visible speed, that this particular audience considers unacceptable. The morality of the complaint is real to the people making it. The mechanism underneath the complaint is exactly the reconversion economy this entire chapter has been describing.
Let us bring the full chapter together now. We began with class conditions shaping the body itself, moved through the three-dimensional map of volume, composition, and trajectory, and now close with the constant, restless movement of capital being converted from one form into another. What is the single thread tying all of this together?
The thread is this: society is not a ladder with fixed rungs, where everyone simply climbs or fails to climb along a single line. It is a space, genuinely spatial, with real coordinates, real distances, and real directions of travel, and every family, every individual, is constantly, sometimes desperately, engaged in strategies to hold or improve their position within that space, converting whichever capital they hold in surplus into whichever capital the current economic and cultural moment rewards most highly. Understanding this space does not merely satisfy curiosity. It changes how you read a news story about inheritance tax, a friend's career pivot, an argument between an entrepreneur and a professor, a creator accused of selling out, a family pouring money into a child's tutoring, or your own grandfather's quiet resentment about a status he feels his family has lost. All of it, once you have this map, becomes legible in a way it was not before.
If this chapter has changed how you will listen to the next family conversation about money, or the next online argument about authenticity, that shift is worth sharing, because almost everyone senses these currents already, and almost nobody has been handed a map precise enough to actually trace them.
In our next chapter, we take this social space and ask the question that has been waiting patiently underneath everything we have discussed so far. How does a position on this map get converted into an actual personality, an actual walk, an actual way of laughing, an actual set of gut reactions that feel, to the person living them, like simply who they are? We turn next to the concept of habitus and to the space of life styles it quietly generates. Join us next time